Hi, my name is Dominik. I'm with das Progressive Zentrum, and it's my greatest pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of our 20+ partner organization to this year's edition of the Progressive Governance Digital Summit. Usually we would come together in person in Berlin or another European capital, but this time is different. Almost all of us have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, may have been in a lockdown or experienced this pandemic out of a first-hand in person with family members or friends. The coronavirus pandemic showed us that we are actually vulnerable. Perhaps we have believed for too long that we are invulnerable, that it is only ever going faster and higher and further, but we were wrong. With these words, the President of Germany, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, described the social political state and feelings of many people during the corona crisis. And we are convinced, for progressives, this is the moment to come together and discuss shared visions of what a post-COVID-19 world could and should look like. As we move from crisis management to rebuilding the economy and society, momentum for change is growing. And we do this digitally this time, asking ourselves actually two things. First, what's at stake for progressives, for our society and economy? How strong is the progressive analysis of the social consequences of this crisis? Who will be affected the most by the negative consequences of this crisis? And what mistakes, but also progressive achievements, have we made in the past coming out of similar crises that were an existential threat to humanity and the societies we live in, such as World War II or the global financial crisis of 2007-2008? And second, what are solutions and concepts of how we can stand together as a progressive community and develop the capacity to govern and address the consequences of the pandemic, but also address the long-term challenges to our societies, including economic inequalities, the climate crisis, or the rise of illiberal and populist forces all across Europe and worldwide. Only through this, a strong analysis and path that can lead us out of this crisis, can we defend liberal democracies and the values progressives hold dear. To address those issues and challenges, each session of the Progressive Governance Summit will focus on one of the following four themes. First, transformation. It's about creating a sustainable recovery and just transition agenda. Second, democracy. So winning the struggle for liberal democracy, rebalancing the responsibilities between the state and society. Third, what we call leadership, progressive leadership. That means winning the public argument and building capacities for progressives to govern. And fourth, what we call Europe Plus, so making the progressive case for Europe and also the case for new multilateralism in times of geopolitical shifts. To do this, analysis and developing solutions along with these four themes, we are very excited about the upcoming days. We have a rich, diverse, and I think quite balanced program of workshops, panel debates, and breakout sessions. We will connect innovators, thinkers, doers with politicians from different political levels from all over Europe and North America. The speakers, presenters, and participants represent a wide range of political backgrounds, including Greens, Liberal, Social Democrats, and also activists. And this bringing together of inspiring people from different camps within the wider progressive spectrum, this kind of cross-border dialogue, this cross-fertilization for a renewal of the political agenda, that is what the following days are all about. So the overarching purpose of the Progressive Governance series is to initiate a conversation about next generation thinking among center-left parties and movements. And those progressive governance conferences and summits have been held worldwide over the last years, from Santiago to London, Oslo, Dublin, Copenhagen, Amsterdam, and Stockholm to Berlin, where it took place in 2017 and 2019. Although this year's Progressive Governance Summit held via digital means, we believe that it can be more impactful than ever, with around 2,500 attendees from over 70 countries registered for this digital summit. Please log in to our platform, get involved, submit questions to the speakers, engage with other participants with our matchmaking platform. And I really hope you see and enjoy this platform. So I will close. In the New York Magazine, there was a great article in April with the headline, "Coronavirus creates an opening for progressivism, also barbarism." And it's up to us, I think, to decide. I now want to hand over to my colleague Max NEUFEIND, who will not only present this year's conference paper on what's at stake and how could progressive answers and strategies look like, but Max will also host the first round of keynote sessions on the 4 themes. Max, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Max. I'm a policy fellow with das Progressive Zentrum. The last weeks and months were more than unusual for all of us and full of anxiety and grief for some of us. Online conferences like this week's Progressive Governance Summit are part of a new normality we are slowly getting used to. The coronavirus pandemic has revealed and accelerated a variety of sometimes contradictory social, economic, and cultural developments. Reliable predictions on how this crisis will change the world in the long term do not exist. How will citizens' trust in states and governments develop? Will there be more or less solidarity in our societies? And with whom? Will there be a change in values? Will we become more or less materialistic, more cosmopolitan, or more communitarian? Will the pandemic lead to a long-term economic slowdown? Will states take a more active role within the economy? Will global cooperation between states crumble, or will new alliances between nations emerge? Since reliable predictions do not exist, we came together as 25 progressive minds from politics, media, journalism, business, and civil society, most of them based in Berlin, to imagine possible futures and develop vivid stories about how these futures came about. We ended up with 6 very different scenarios for the year 2025. You find them in detail in our report, What's at Stake? Our Societies After Corona. Again, these scenarios are not forecasts. They are meant to help thinking about possible futures, about turning points, about opportunities seized and opportunities missed. The scenarios should function as points of reference for the discussions we are going to have in the next days here at the Progressive Governance Summit. As you will see, the scenarios are not simply divided into positive and negative ones. Some of them have characteristics that seem quite desirable for progressives. And sometimes the progressive camp might be divided on how desirable such a world would in fact be. The first scenario is called New Golden Age. It's a world where politically and economically unified Europeans and democratically governed United States were able to take on a new role as solidary global crisis managers, where liberal democracies have developed a so-called new social contract with a strong appreciation for community-oriented professions, where economic action is re-embedded into society, where in all central realms of life, work, relationships, housing, education, the question of quality of life has been posed anew. In the second scenario, called Varieties of Localism, most people shifted their thinking and action to the local level, while some people form diverse local communities where cooperative farmland is cultivated or where urban gardening projects are mushrooming. Others join segregated, ethnically homogeneous communities. For them, the idea of local and regional resilience turned into xenophobic and racist resentment. In many communities, everyday political life is dominated by the conflict between these two worldviews. The world of localism is not a world of harmony. Rather, it's a world where the space of confrontation has been redefined. Extrapolating current tendencies of individualism, we drew a third scenario where trust in collective system has been entirely eroded. Radical individualism foresees how, after the outbreak of further waves of the pandemic, governments have lost the confidence of their populations and most of their room for fiscal maneuver. The very concept of society is considered naive. It is replaced by highly individualized physical and digital gated communities. The mantra of "my country first" has spread. The idea of a principled global order is gone. The influence of East Asia on our societies is the starting point of our fourth scenario, called welfare technocracy. The much better crisis management in East Asia has triggered a debate in Europe about societal values and the right way to govern. In 2025, scientists and expert commissions are actively involved in political decision-making. However, critical voices that question the basic assumption of politically propagated rational action are systematically excluded from public discourse. The shift towards authoritarian communitarianism is even stronger in the fifth scenario, which we called national populism. Here, it is combined with a general rollback in values. The good life takes place at home, not in the world. National self-determination is propagated. Nativist ideas and the ideal of a traditional family are dominating social roles. There's hardly any political participation in the form of positive citizenship rights. Europe sees a disintegration of social democracy. And then there's scenario 6, which we called school trip. The economic and social conditions in 2025 are basically like the ones in the summer of 2019. Same for the state of international relations. The pandemic remains a small episode in memories of contemporaries. It is remembered as a superficial external shock that was felt only for a limited period of time. So, what can we learn from these 6 scenarios? Firstly, there is a lot at stake for our societies. Where there's a chance for the dawn of a new progressive age, there's also the real danger of slipping into a world of illiberalism, selfishness, and declining welfare. And secondly, progressives have to win the public argument about how to interpret the current crisis and the challenges it reveals. The next months are decisive. Progressives must set out to lead the renewal of our society. Therefore, in our report, we also suggest an outline of a progressive agenda for the next years to come. An attempt to formulate what progressives should agree on and start debating today. There are 4 main themes. First, safeguarding and innovating democracy. Second, pushing for a just and sustainable transformation. Third, making a progressive case for Europe and a new era of multilateralism. And perhaps most importantly, fourth, new progressive leadership. Now, let me highlight some of the main ideas, starting with safeguarding and innovating democracy. Democratic crisis management is better crisis management. As we observed in the past weeks, accountable governments and a critical public sphere didn't make countries' crisis response less effective. On the contrary, only if measures are justified by deliberative processes, they will be efficient in the long term. Nevertheless, progressives must go beyond democracy's instrumental benefits. For progressives, democracy and the defense of individual freedoms describe a path, at the same time the goal of a society of the free and the equal. Such a society can only be realized if those who do not have a strong and organized voice are involved in the democratic process. Public spaces, be they daycare centers or schools, marketplaces, pubs or choral societies, are a central prerequisite for democracy and for social cohesion. In recent weeks, everyday encounters in our cities and small towns have drastically decreased. But public spaces where society comes together across social and cultural lines were in decline even before the pandemic. Progressives thus must become advocates of the public space and of the public sphere. Especially in crisis situations, we need journalism that stands for professional rigor, representativeness, and inclusiveness. Without integrative and representative media, the project of liberal democracy fails. It is a central task for progressive politics to shape the media world of the digital age. The role of science is of equal importance. In what kind of society we want to live is not a question that can be answered by scientists. The place for societal decision-making is politics. At the same time, politics would be unable to respond to the current situation without solid scientific evidence and advice. Thus, progressives should encourage a broad and democratic debate on scientific findings and their possible implications. But safeguarding democratic governance is not the only challenge ahead. An economic transformation that is at the same time just and sustainable is urgently needed. The current crisis provides opportunities for progressives to kickstart just that. Many national governments have been supporting companies that got into economic distress due to the pandemic. and rightly so. But progressives must be crystal clear. If the public is helping out the private sector in times of acute crisis, using substantial resources, private sector actors are obliged to make every effort to modernize our economies in the most encompassing sense, towards more equality, sustainability, and technological progress. And talking about sustainability, the past weeks have shown how decisive societies can act when they have to. Some argue that in view of the even greater threat of climate change, a next round of restrictions on individual freedoms should be initiated. Progressives must refrain from this argument. We should act on climate now in the most decisive manner while safeguarding democracy and freedom. We all learned in the past weeks which professions societies particularly depend on in times of crisis. But progressives need to do more than airing general statements of sympathy and goodwill towards our fellow citizens working in these professions. We must fight for a genuine upgrading of professions that are so fundamental to the stability of our societies. But we also have to look at the so-called Generation Corona. Young people entering the labor market today carry a particular burden. At the same time, there's the willingness of many people to show mutual solidarity. It is now for progressives to push for a program that ensures fair life chances for the coming generation, from guaranteed education and training to a credible promise of a reliable pension. These ideas of a progressive future then have to be embedded in a progressive case for Europe and a new era of multilateralism. In many places, the initial response to the pandemic was to shut borders. In the past weeks, though, many people are once again realizing that Europeans are stronger united. This unity, however, requires much bolder steps towards fiscal, political, and social union. A progressive agenda for Europe must be about unlocking the enormous treasure that united action, solidarity, and cooperation represent. The coronavirus crisis is accelerating the global disintegration into economic blocs. Only an integrated and dynamic European economy can secure living standards. Progressives should push for an ambitious common European productivity policy and European public goods to increase prosperity and security across Europe. We must refute national populist thinking and formulate a pan-European strategy of prosperity going beyond austerity that gains legitimacy in all member states. And looking beyond Europe, there's no doubt that the world would be better off today had there been more international cooperation on health and issues. Progressives must advocate for strengthening and modernizing international institutions and promote new cooperations. This holds true especially for the relations of Western societies with the global South. Now, how can all this come about? In our view, it can be done through new progressive leadership. The economic discourse is changing. We are seeing that the ideologies of deregulation and there is no alternative are coming under pressure in many countries. Questions of how to run an economy and how to distribute resources are once again on the agenda. This marks a window of opportunity for progressives. This is the time to bring fundamental questions of distribution and the role of the state to the center of public debate. To this end, we have to offer concrete utopias. While progressives excel in forming narratives, they lack real-life signature projects based on a clear analysis of social groups willing to support them. Small-scale technocracy and abstract debates about virtues are not enough. We need well-designed visions to touch, so to say, stimulating the appetite of the broad middle of society for progressive transformation. And progressives have to develop and represent a new style of government. In past weeks, citizens, at least in some countries, witnessed a more pragmatic and agile way of how to run a government and administration. A style of governance that puts citizens' problems before departmental logic. We must develop a visibly progressive way of governing, one that is problem-oriented, transparent, and participatory. To sum up, the future is wide open. There is a chance for more democracy, a new economic order, and a fresh start of the multilateral project. Progressives must set out to lead the renewal of our societies out of this crisis. This will not be possible without a broad coalition across national and party boundaries. To form such an alliance is precisely the purpose of the Progressive Governance Summit 2020. So, after this tour d'horizon, we are going to have now 4 lightning talks focusing on the 4 themes I just outlined. And the group of people that will speak to you now could hardly be more fitting. And this group is, in my view, nothing but phenomenal. We will start with a lightning talk on democracy by YASCHA MOUNK. YASCHA MOUNK was born in Munich and is now an associate professor at Johns Hopkins University. He is considered one of the leading experts on the crises of Western democracies and the challenge of right-wing populism. And perhaps it's worth mentioning, YASCHA joined the German Social Democratic Party at the age of 13 and left again at the age of 33. So, over to you, YASCHA.
Thank you very much for having me speak to you in this virtual forum, which we've now all been forced to do for these last months, and I fear we'll have to do for a good few months longer. I'm very sad that we can't all be together in person because it's a really important community of people thinking about the future of politics in Germany and beyond, but I trust that this convening will be meaningful even in this virtual format. So I think my brief is to talk about democracy in its state and what we might have to do to improve it, and that has to start with a diagnosis. And I want to think about the ways in which these painful last months of the global pandemic of COVID-19 have inflected the diagnosis which I've made of the crisis of democracy a few years ago. So I've been warning, as many of you may know, for a good number of years about the dangers posed by the rise of populism. What people like me and a few of my colleagues have been trying to warn since the very beginning is not only that some of these populists might actually end up with real political power, as is now very evident, but that if they do gain real power, that would ultimately impact the lives of ordinary people in very serious ways. That when you do not tolerate dissent, when you say that you and you alone truly speak for the people, when you disregard the advice of experts, when you cannot tolerate the existence of independent political institutions, all of that reduces the ability of a state to actually do its job and look after the well-being of ordinary citizens. Now, I think for a long time, that message did not come through to most citizens. And the reasons for that are understandable. If you lived in the United States 4 or 5 months ago, likelihood was, with the exception of some groups that were particularly targeted by Donald Trump, life was about as good for you as 4 years before. And that's because it takes a long time to erode political institutions. It takes a long time for bad management from the top to actually have an impact on the lives of people. You can think of the ship of state as a kind of ocean liner. Even once the captain is drunk, it takes a long time for that to affect the course of the ocean liner. And even once it starts to zigzag in crazy ways, it won't hit an iceberg right away. Tragically, we have now hit that iceberg. And we've seen to what extent, especially countries ruled by authoritarian populists, countries from the United States to Brazil, to arguably in a different form and vein of populism in the United Kingdom, have really done much worse at dealing with this pandemic than countries like Germany or South Korea with responsible and effective political leadership. So the price that people have to pay for all of those worrying tendencies in our politics have now become very evident. That's the respect in which I would say that COVID-19 has accelerated trends that were existing previously in the political sphere and confirmed some of the discourse, which started off marginal 4 years ago, but have become dominant in the last months and years, the ways in which we're already thinking about politics. Now, I also want to challenge myself and challenge you a little bit more by speaking a bit about ways in which these last months should perhaps cause us to rethink to some extent. Because when you look carefully, it is not just the United States and Brazil that has done poorly in responding to the pandemic. Even countries that now more or less have a pandemic under control had real failings in the reaction to the pandemic. It's not a populist party in Germany, but the minister of one of the ruling parties who even in early March was still comparing this pandemic to the flu and saying we really shouldn't be worried about it too much. And within the countries that have really failed, it's not just people like Donald Trump who are responsible, but also those who are part of established institutions, those who are experts. It is striking that the WHO has given misleading public health guidance for a very long time, has clearly, under some political influence, downplayed the importance of this pandemic for a very long time. It is striking to what extent the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control in the United States, have messed up the testing regime at the beginning of the pandemic. It is striking to what extent many public health officials in the United States have undermined their own credibility by appearing not to be politically neutral towards different causes, by pretending that certain forms of protests are healthy, even when they clearly pose a danger of a spread of COVID-19. The failure of state capacity in the United States is beyond anything we might have imagined. And while it has certainly been compounded and worsened by Donald Trump and others, the rot clearly goes deeper than that. And so one thing that I've been thinking about a little bit for the last days and weeks, something I'm not yet sure about, but which is nagging at me, is that we may have to reevaluate our view of our own democracies and institutions and societies in some crucial respects. When populists rose to power 5 or so years ago, and they started to gain political prominence, their slogan was always that elites and experts and the establishment weren't up to the task that we owe to them, that they failed to live up to their vast responsibilities. At the time, I dismissed those points and focused on the danger that populists pose. Today, I would perhaps slightly refine that judgment. I still think that populists are incredibly dangerous. I still think, as we are seeing in these months, that they actually compound the failings that they warn about. But I wonder whether we need to become less complacent about the failings of all of us in this virtual room, the failings of people in the political establishment, the failings of experts, the failings of institutions. Because I think the warning that they are not, in fact, up to the task politically in terms of getting people along, getting buy-in into our institutions, but also just practically in terms of things like being able to respond to a global pandemic. I think that goes deeper than perhaps we wanted to realize, especially in countries like the United States. So as we're thinking about the future of progressive governance, I think we need to think about ways in which we can continue to fight and marginalize populists, the way in which we can win crucial countries like the United States and Brazil back, making sure that they pull back from the brink of incipient dictatorships. But I also think that it would behoove us to be a little bit more self-critical and to think about how a range of institutions, from elites to experts to the political class, can actually live up to its tasks in a much better way. Well, with this small provocation. I hope you'll have a lot to debate about, and I look forward to seeing many of you back in Berlin in the months and years to come, when we have hopefully gotten through this horrible historical moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yascha. And now we will turn to the theme of transformation. We will be joined by MAJA GÖPEL. As a Secretary General, MAJA heads the German Advisory Council on Global Change. And MAJA is the co-initiator of Scientists for Future. And she's a best-selling author. In her recent book, Rethinking Our World, an Invitation, MAJA convincingly argues that we cannot solve the ecological question if we do not also understand it as a social question. So let's hear what MAJA has to say.
When we speak of transformation, two things I would say are really important to bear in mind. The first thing is that the discovery transformation has been the birth of sustainable development. Because in the 1960s and 1970s, we did notice that humans and human activity and their way of running economies is transforming our planet to a degree that it will hamper our own future. So we shouldn't be talking about only the people wanting sustainability, seeking to transform something, but the people seeking sustainability have said, we are transforming our planet in an undesirable way, so why don't we instead transform human institutions so that humanity and our ecosystems become a harmonious, cohabiting place on a safe planet Earth. So this is the first point on transformation. It's been our activities that sustainable development would like to correct. The second one is that transformation has been happening anyway. Before Corona, some people are now talking about the normality to go back to that was for Corona. This was not a normality. It was a high-risk society, as the World Economic Forum reports have stated just in January, with environmental issues being at the very top of the global risks of the next 10 years, both in impact and in likelihood. So that there would be transformation of our societies anyway due to the accelerating threats and risks coming from environmental degradation was already out there. And with it coupled were the increasing concerns, obviously, about social inequality and international inequality and an increasing upwards trickling of wealth and possession and thus power and control over world developments by very few people. So transformation was already in the air when the corona pandemic hit. And this is why I think it is very important to never speak about a normality that we could go to, but to be very clear that we would like to create something that is a desirability, something that is positive to look forward to, so that we get out of the defense against something into the creating of something that we are actually valuing and do feel energy and feel like it is a mission of us to achieve. Because this is really important from transformation science. We understand when the old is dying and the new cannot quite yet be born, we don't know yet exactly how the sustainable economies can look like, how international cooperation can flourish when we have to learn how to share instead of thinking we can outgrow all the distributional conflicts that we've been avoiding through that pathway. So how do we, in that moment of the old dying and the new not quite being born, in that openness that we're all now really sensing, how do we find collaboration and purpose and direction that will allow for many of us to feel like we're in a team that is doing something good, positive, and create the energy and the willingness to try something new? And this is why the 4 Ps I think are important. Purpose I've already been alluring to, and we've seen purpose really been shining a light on through COVID. It was human health, human collaboration, human intact collaboration structures, especially at times where the normal routines have been disrupted. That was creating the social wealth and the cohesion in our societies, that we feel safe when things become dire. And the other one was obviously the environmental surroundings, both in the causing of probably this zoonotic virus, but also when we started understanding, how do supply chains actually work, especially in our food system. We started for the first time really think about it again when the shelves were empty. Where does this come from? And how do we ensure the provision of this is going to be maintained in the future? So resilience has been another key term there. So we had a very clear idea of what economies should deliver. They should deliver human health and well-being and cohesion within the planetary boundaries that allow for us to make sure that provision security can be maintained in the future. So the purpose is clear, but now we need the 3 more Ps, which is the progress ideal and how it manifests itself in our balancing sheets, in our indicators for development, and in our discourse, basically, about what we're after. Because then only can we decide where is it that we want to go when we're talking about progress. And that we've had ample discussions about moving beyond GDP, which are now coming up again slowly. We have value balancing alliances, companies coming forward saying we do understand that we have to know much better what is actually happening in our business model, and that it goes beyond just the financial reporting. We've seen in the health sector, unless we really ensure that there is some buffers and that there is some redundancy and diversity, which are all aspects of resilient systems, we will not be able to absorb shocks when they come around. So economic efficiency has to be complemented by social and environmental indicators. And big data allows for us to really do this in a much different way than we had possibilities before. So really widening the set of what we're looking at when we're talking about progress, talking about good business, successful business, and really championing the do no harm principle that's being discussed in the Green Deal, that we stop increasing the environmental damage, but really go into regenerating both the environmental health and the planetary health in terms of what humans are eating and how they're relating with their ecosystems. So that can be the progress ideal, and we up those benchmarks so we stop justifying alternative policy proposals according to the benchmarks that are signifying an old, outdated, high-risk model. So we're turning the burden of proof around. Everything that wants to stay the way it is has to justify itself why it would be a good idea to maintain the status quo, the pre-corona normal, because every single simulation in any sustainability report says the business as usual scenario, not a good future. And this is why we've been talking about pathways, the P number 4. It's not about having an abrupt change like corona has now imposed on many societies. So we're not comparing, when we're thinking about climate change policies that are successful, with what's happened now, even though we had the environmental recovery in some places. What we are talking about is transition periods, and there have been roadmaps for about 10 years. The coal regions have been developed quite far in the just transition idea. Most and foremost, and really important, is in all of those to make people become co-stewards of those transformations. Because we need that cultural shift very, very urgently. What we've been seeing is that we're talking about winners and losers, a near zero-sum game. But what we're talking about is that everyone that is a citizen gains a prosperous future possibility. So letting go of structures that are not sustainable anymore, like coal mining or maybe some parts of our automobile industry, is an integral part of allowing the new to emerge faster. So those are 2 sides of the same coin, and we should stop talking about winners and losers, but co-creators by letting go and letting emerge the new, of which we are then all citizens. And to reclaim the identity of citizens that goes much beyond just consumers that we are talking to right now, do consume as much as you can so we get back to old unsustainable consumption patterns, or as people that will lose their jobs. We had so many surveys where people said, I would like to try myself in a different job. So how do we get there with a summit of not the future of work, but the work of the future? Yet again, jump into the future, think about that imaginary space where we'd like to go, and mobilize people. And the last P to change then is politics. Because I even find in a progressive summit, yes, I would love to talk about what is progressive, and then I would think about how can we throw the best ideas of all different camps together. So just like winners and losers, I want the best of conservatives, the best of liberals, the best of Greens, and the best of social parties to be in this mix to identify what can be the new normal or the sustainable future that we'd like to go to. And this can be progressive, but I wouldn't delineate progressives from others. I would say let's make the camp of the people working for that future as big as possible. And I hope this summit will contribute to that. Thank you.
Our third lightning talk is on the issue of a renewed European project. We will be joined by OPHÉLIE OMNES. OPHÉLIE is a business lawyer and the president of the French chapter of the Young European Federalists, JEF. And we're happy to announce that since yesterday, OPHÉLIE is a visiting fellow at das Progressive Zentrum. So please join me in welcoming OPHÉLIE.
I am OPHÉLIE, and I've always been passionate about Europe. Of course, there's the intellectual and political interest. I am a lawyer during the day, and what I call my night job and weekend job is being a political activist. And I've been an activist for quite some years now, almost 10. And somehow Europe got very personal to me, although it shouldn't have, or at least there was no predisposition of mine to become such a European fighter. I was born in France, from a French family. Both of my parents are French, and I've lived in France my entire childhood. But there was this one geography lesson I got at school when I was 10, and I really fell in love with Europe there. I just got explained how it worked and how we've decided some decades ago to build this beautiful project together, and I just fell for it. And ever since, it's become so personal that I've built my life across Europe through work, through love stories, through friendships. Actually, a lot of my very close friends live in other countries of Europe, whether that's Germany, Italy, Belgium, or even the UK. And when we heard about the lockdown here in France, one of my first thoughts were actually that if I couldn't move out from my house, meaning if I couldn't go and see my parents here in France, it also meant that I couldn't go abroad. And realizing that was something that was extremely sad for me, because I didn't realize there was a border before. I was just crossing them every now and then and never even thought about it. And for once, and maybe for the first time, I think I really understood what it meant to have borders here in Europe, to have member states that actually had different ways of handling things, whereas we sort of used to decide things together, to have rights all over the continent, to just think our lives without having different realities. And to think about that made me very sad. And it made me think that this coronavirus crisis, which obviously was a sanitary crisis at first, soon to be an economic crisis, I was worried that it might become a crisis about Europe. And to be very fair, I didn't really have much hope in the beginning, because you had all those member states that didn't really know how to react, and then that decided that they would just do what they thought they wanted to do. And then you ended up having France and its neighboring countries with so many different realities, whereas we actually shared borders and we shared a history and we shared a reality in society. But all of a sudden, all of that was gone. And I think it's actually interesting to see it from an activist point of view, because, I've said it, I've been active for quite some time now. And when we were doing our usual activities at the beginning of the year, say January or February, well, the rhetoric wasn't good. We were trying to talk about Europe, talk about how much it should be improved, and people were not really reacting to that. Or when they were reacting, it was more about, but what if the national solution was a better story? Or what if actually Europe didn't work that much and then we actually needed to take back control? So it was sort of a depressing moment for us activists at the beginning of the year, when we didn't really feel like there was so much hope for the European future and the future of its construction. And during the crisis, I was actually struck by the fact that all of a sudden, so many people were waiting so much from Europe, and they were actually waiting for more than what they had given it. Of course, we could have expected the European countries to give to the European Union enough power to deal with an health crisis or a sanitary crisis. But the thing is, the European Union does not have this competence because the member state didn't give it to it. And all of a sudden, we were waiting so much from Europe when actually not providing it with the right tool originally. And so I thought, they're waiting for more Europe. But before, like, Europe was sort of the problem. So it actually confused me a bit. And then, of course, there was this lack of solidarity between the member states that made you think, is that really the Europe we have? Is that really the Europe we deserve, to have such a lack of understanding and of mutual support between people, between countries? Then we saw also like the rule of law that was completely collapsing in some countries, that could actually highlight how weak it had been all the time. And our European institution taking so much time to react. And I thought, okay, so this is a make it or break it situation. It means that either we make it and we realize that this is the moment we can take to actually improve the system, or it's just going to collapse. And for a while, I was really not convinced that we could be able to make it. And I really thought, okay, so this might actually be the last fight that we have. So we at least make it count. So I sort of spent my entire lockdown trying to gather forces, trying to understand how much we could volunteer and advocate for more Europe at a time where people actually felt the need for it. And so the question that I often have, and I often add over the days, about what is this Europe we want, and how much different is it from the Europe we currently have? Like, to begin with, it will be more democratic, and it needs to be more democratic, meaning that we need to make sure we respect rule of law throughout the entire continent. We need to make sure we have mechanisms that actually work. We also need to make sure that our citizens feel like we protect them, that they are being taken care of, and that actually they are listened to. So it's important to listen to the people and to make them understand that it's not only populists that care about their fear for the everyday life, that progressists as well are interested in knowing what they have to say. And from an outside perspective, because the challenges are not only from the inside, they're also from the outside, we need to count as a global actor. And we need to be present on the international scene, because multilateralism has been damaged. And we can see it with the way the US perform on the international scene. We can see it with the way China didn't really inform us about what was coming. We tend to forget about Russia these days, but it's still there. There are still very big players that play in a way that is not the fair play that the European have established as a rule into international affairs. And if we want to continue our work on the international scene, if we want to matter, if we want to stay at the negotiation table and provide some protection to our people, we need to count. And in order to count, we need to be united. Otherwise, there's no point. No one will care about what France and Germany think. And I think it's already the case. No one really cares about what France alone think. We only care about what France in Europe might be able to say, which means that what is important in the end is the European framework, not necessarily our nation state that are actually now too small to count. So it's important also to protect our citizens from the outside, because one thing is to make them feel protected on the inside, but we also need to make them feel protected on the outside. So we need to have a strong diplomacy. We even need to have some military forces to protect the people if that would be the case. So we need a strong EU, basically, both on the inside and on the outside. And the thing is, one might ask, but how do you actually reach that vision that actually seems so far away from what we can actually achieve. And I would say that often we Federalists are considered idealists. And I think that this time it cannot be the case anymore, because thinking that the Europe we want is a federal one that would work in a federal system through local to global level, and that would ensure a decision-making process that is actually efficient. It's not being idealistic anymore. It's just being pragmatic. This is the only solution we can actually have and put on the table, because the crisis has highlighted all the flaws of the European Union. But the thing is, we progressists already knew that. We already knew that all those flaws were there. And I would dare to say that it's just time for us to use that momentum. It's time for us to take every chance that we're being given to make sure that we get into better and not into worse. Because, well, we shouldn't fool ourselves. If this is a make it or break it situation, it means that either we make it better and we make it work, or it would just destroy itself from the inside. Because there is no staying as we currently are. It's either moving forward or just letting everything collapse. And I have to say, I wasn't really hopeful at first. And then with the Franco-German proposal, a very large proposal that was backed by the Commission, I began to have hope again. I thought, this is a big step. This is meaningful. And so maybe we can actually move forward, and maybe we can take it as an opportunity to reinvent ourselves. And I thought, yeah, good that the Franco-German engine works again. But I mean, if you have a good engine, it doesn't make you go as far as if you have an entire structure, right? So the idea is that we need to take everyone on board. We need to take the South, because Italy, Spain, Portugal, they've shown their interest into moving forward. We need to take the East, it's eastern part of Europe as well. And we even might want to take the reluctant North together with us. But what we shouldn't do is to wait for everyone to be ready. We should move and start moving with the coalition of the willing, and start moving to achieve things, to deliver, to show our people that we can neutralize resources, diplomatic force, and military and defense tools to protect them and to make their everyday life better. So I think this is a turning point. It won't be an easy solution to move forward and try to achieve this federal state, but also it is the only chance we have. There is no other way. And Europe has always built itself through crisis. So I think it's just time to reinvent the system and to finish, finally, the European integration that we started such a long time ago. So in the end, you might want to think about practical tools or ways that we can take as an opportunity to change the system. And that will be the conference on the future of Europe. We citizens, during this conference, need to be at the table of negotiation. We need to claim for structural changes, and if it goes through treaty changes, then so be it. We need to be ready to fight for having a new system, even if that implies having a new constitution, even if that implies dreaming big. We need to expect a lot. We need to put so much effort into it, and we sort of need to live up to our expectations. So let's think about the fact that 70 years ago, Robert Schuman had this declaration of his that became history and the beginning of the European Union we know today. And if after such a dramatic event as the war, France and Germany were able to work together and to start building the common project, why wouldn't we be able to do it now, even after the crisis we've had? We need to learn from the past to build our future, and we need to understand that the only way out of it is together.
So with this young voice from France, we move to our final theme, which is progressive leadership. And I could not ask for a better speaker on this issue than Jeremy CLIFFE. As the Economist's bureau chief in Berlin and in Brussels, Jeremy gained the most intimate insights into the inner workings of European politics. And in his new role as international editor of the New Statesman, Jeremy provides an even broader perspective. But most importantly, if I may say that as a fellow 30-something European, Jeremy is one of the sharpest minds of our generation, who's as witty as he is humble. So, Jeremy, great to have you with us.
High-intensity politics. The pandemic and its aftermath are going to generate an array of new policy priorities and create genuine room for a renewal of progressive thinking on everything from the role of the state and the construction of a resilient society to new frontiers of data and digital technology. That much is beyond doubt. But the crucial question is, how, in this new environment, can these ideas be put into practice? How do you turn the ideas into action and into real change? How do you build the consent for them and secure mandates to make them realities? It is tempting to go down what I'm calling the apolitical path. You might look at the events of the past months, how governments and citizens around the world have responded to them, and say, now is the age of the technocrat. Expertise is back, the nation state is back. The Republican vision of government, in which the elected representatives and their officials make the choices on behalf of the citizens, is back. I think that's half right, but only half right. Yes, I think this crisis has been a blow for populists and has elevated the role of facts and science and apolitical experts in public life. But simultaneously, and I don't think this is a contradiction, it has been a politicizing moment. This crisis has not suspended politics. Quite the opposite, in fact. It has brought the very essence of politics to the fore. Politics, after all, is so much more fundamental than elections and presidents and slogans. It's about who wields power in society and in whose interests. It's about how societies navigate painful moral choices and trade-offs, how they deal with shocks, and how they build and sustain common identities with emotional meaning. It's not just about the nation-state, but what happens in our streets and neighborhoods, in villages and cities on the one hand, and what happens between countries, across borders, and between far-flung but interconnected parts of the globe on the other. Bearing all that in mind, how could you possibly look at the past months and say this is an apolitical moment? COVID-19 has been a technocratic moment, but it has also been an intensely political one. People who did not feel affected by politics are being drawn into it. New social coalitions are being built. Politics is seeping down into local life, but also up into the international sphere. I do not think that it is entirely coincidental that the surge of the Black Lives Matter movement through neighborhoods and around the world has happened in the febrile environment created by the pandemic. The kaleidoscope has been shaken, as the saying goes, and the pieces are in flux. Moreover, we can be certain that this will not be the genuinely global moment of the interconnected world. It will be the first genuinely global moment of the interconnected world. There will be more pandemics. There will be environmental crises. There will be the worldwide transformation of societies into zero-carbon models that may happen gradually, but may also lurch forward in moments of shock. So let's resist the temptation to say progressive politics must be the reassuring guardian of sensible technocratic government. The risk of doing merely that in an intensely political moment is that you cede high-energy politics to the populists and anti-system nihilists who have no rightful claim to it. Progressives need to be the champions both of expertise and order, but also agitators and disruptors. And they have to be comfortable with the idea that those two roles are entirely complementary. What they need can be summed up by the Brazilian theorist and Harvard law professor Roberto Unger in the term high-energy politics. Unger defines high-energy politics by 5 things. First, he says, the raising of the temperature of politics, raising the level of popular engagement in it. Second, hastening the pace of politics, the idea that change can happen gradually but can also happen very fast in moments of transformation. Third, combining central power with local initiative. that is to say, allowing experimentation and a diversity of models to flourish. Fourth, because politics can often be overwhelmingly majoritarian, establishing a distinct authority to rescue excluded and disadvantaged groups, correcting those biases towards the majority. Fifth, and finally, gradually enhancing representative democracy through participative democracy. I think that's a useful framework. And I'm going to finish this talk with some thoughts on what it might mean for progressives in this moment at 3 different levels. First, the local and deeply subnational level. This matters because this is the level at which people actually live their lives. The crisis has shown the importance of place and neighbourhood. So for political parties, high-energy politics at that level should mean being central to local battles against loneliness, against the closing off of public spaces, against the inequities that play out in streets, in villages, and in neighbourhoods. It also means being the meeting point for a wider network of community volunteering and campaigning groups. It means using democratic innovations, like citizens' assemblies, to raise the temperature of local politics, treating each place as a laboratory for democracy. The second level is the national one, which still matters very much, mostly because this is still fundamentally where different coalitions coalesce, fragment, and recoalesce. Here, high-energy politics is about building coalitions more actively, working together not just across different progressive political parties, but across the wider spectrum of national campaigning organisations. Particularly, it also means moving fast when new democratic moments or movements materialise. The conventional centre-left, Social Democrats particularly, have a poor track record in recent years of integrating emergent forces, from gender equality campaigns to the anti-discrimination and environmentalism movements. If it's not careful, the current Black Lives Matter moment could be another such example. Move with social change, in other words, before it moves past you. At the national level, high-energy politics also means rejecting the snobism that says, we don't do identity politics. If you don't do identity politics, others will. Emotion, identity, belonging, and symbolism only need to be at odds with fact, evidence, and expertise if you make them. They should go hand in hand. And last but not least is the international level. This matters because this is where most of the forces that ultimately shape our lives play out. For many years, everything has been globalized more or less, but our politics. Capital was globalized. Goods were globalized. Gradually, services and data have also been globalized, but our politics has often remained stuck at the national level, where it is ineffective at harnessing and controlling those forces. That is now thankfully changing, driven by both supply factors, like the rise of social media and spreading political causes and messages, and demand factors, like the growing urgency of obviously international political issues like climate change, migration, and economic volatility. Look at the European election last year, which was easily the most genuinely European campaign yet, and saw rising turnout for the first time in decades. Look at the way the Fridays for Future movement spread out from Europe around the world. Look at the way the Black Lives Matter movement has spread from America around the world. By the way, I think the next big causes may be debt relief for the global south in the wake of the economic crisis, and a global campaign on data rights as biosurveillance is rolled out to prevent further pandemic outbreaks. Progressives have to be part of those debates. And yes, that means organising and sharing ideas internationally at events like Progressive Governance. But it also means opening up the transnational political space. The EU has made big strides forward in this crisis, breaking old taboos with its rescue package. But now the question is how to intensify and update its democratic structures to keep up with that. How do progressives help coalitions like Fridays for Future build their voice in what are as yet pre-democratic international institutions? How do we get the resources into this emergent global civil society? And how do we build democracy into those institutions? This year is the 75th anniversary of the founding of the UN. Perhaps it's time, for example, to revisit the idea of the UN Parliamentary Assembly. I've written these things before and have been told they're contradictory. You can't have technocratic expertise and high-energy democracy. You can't stand for a strong, resilient nation-state and subsidiarity. If you want global politics to meet the challenges of global forces, you're ignoring ordinary people and the local concerns that matter in their lives. These are all the sort of false contradictions in which progressives, unlike many of their political opponents, have for too long and too often being tangled up. Now, in this febrile moment, this historical juncture, it is not the time to get tangled up in them all over again. Now is the time to think big, to integrate groups and causes at all possible levels, and to be, in the best sense of the word, political.
With this concise analysis by Jeremy Cliffe, we're going to turn to the final section of our opening session of the Progressive Governance Summit. What we want to do now is to split up in basically 3 breakout rooms. The only condition is that you registered on our platform. And if you're registered, you can now decide with whom you want to engage in a conversation. First, with Jeremy Cliffe and MAJA GÖPEL on the issues of transformation and leadership. Second, with YASCHA MOUNK and OPHÉLIE OMNES on the issues of democracy and Europe. And finally, there's just me, basically, and Mark Sachser, who's the head of the Asia department of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. And Mark and I, we're going to explain to you a little bit more in detail what our scenarios are about, and we are really looking forward to being challenged by you on these scenarios and the strategies we derive from them. So that's for the moment from here. Let's meet in a couple of minutes in the breakout rooms. Thank you so much for your attention, and see you around. Thank you so much.